I'm Cherky Angelo, or as you know, Samuel King. I starting reading to you a brief chapter of my book H.P. Lovecraft, The Hidden Coven. Let's now establish a fixed point. The trips I mentioned above took place in the years 1922-1923. In subsequent years, Lovecraft made many other trips, but they were related to his work as a writer, including his stay in New York in the years 1924-1925, related to his later failed marriage with Sonia Green, and a trip to Florida in 1934 to visit his correspondent and distant cousin R.H. Barlow. Going back to the travels of the 1922 period, the first concrete relationship I could notice between the travels I made the stories of the myth was that Lovecraft created the so-called Lovecraft Country, so named by the American writer and musician Kate Harbour. While the first two stories of the myth, Dagon, 1917, and The Nameless City, 1921, were set respectively in the Pacific Islands and desert of Arabia, quite classic places of the adventure stories of the time. Many of the later ones were set in this territory created by H.P.L., but centrally based on the places he visited. From this, H.P.L. drew a powerful inspiration, creating landscapes described in his books, which were later defined as the nightmarish New England and baptized Lovecraft Country. For the American people, the word country or country always evokes west countryside with huge cultivated areas scattered with small towns populated by a people a bit backward, dedicated to agriculture, and country parties accompanied by music called country show. However, Lovecraft Country evokes slightly different scenarios. An imaginary country with its village and a small town, Arkham, Dunwich, Innsmouth on the coast, and the Miskatonic River, and a mountain place like Dean's Corner and Aylesbury Peak. In reality, these names do not exist, but one of the greatest biographers and fans of Lovecraft, the Indian T.S. Joshi, has shown that there are undeniable similarities between the Lovecraft Country and the real places existing in Massachusetts. If we analyze the facts presented here, some interesting consideration can be drawn. First, if before his travels in Massachusetts, Lovecraft never used local setting for his stories, while afterwards he even created an entire imaginary country to the set of the myth of Cthulhu. I would say that the influence of these journeys in the creation of the myths themselves is indeniable. Second, as we have seen, most of the novels and the tales of the myth of Cthulhu were written after these journeys. These reports seem to me to be important and I would say undeniable, and I'm surprised that they have not been thoroughly analyzed so far. The very name country, chosen to briefly describe Lovecraft's imaginary places, if analyzed, allows other interesting connections to be established. In his stories, Lovecraft describes wild places, forests, impervious mountains, uninhabited moors and small towns, such as Dunwich, made up of old and dilapidated houses dating back to the first colonization of the 17th century, populated by backward inhabitants isolated from civilization and genetically degraded. For those who are already familiar with the American culture and folklore, all these elements are impressive reminders of a place, this time totally real, described in the works of Vance Randolph. Born in 1892 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, Randolph was a famous folklore scholar, and his name is linked to his works on the folklore on the famous Ozark Country, Missouri. Randolph published numerous works on the Ozark, including The Ozarks, 1931, Ozark Mountain Folks, 1932, and the famous Ozark Superstitions, 1947. Randolph, after a background as a university researcher, moved to Ozark Country for his ethnological studies, residing permanently in the country since 1920 without ever leaving it, also marrying a local native woman. In his book, published after the first HPL stories describing his country, such as The Horror of Dunwich, 1928, Randolph describes the real country of Ozark, located between Missouri and Arkansas, with strange analogies. Rugged and sometimes wild landscapes, wood hills and impervious mountains, and small towns populated by inhabitants who remained on the margins of the modern civilization, descendant of the first settlers who moved to the region who speak a particular dialect. Also, the hillbillies of Ozark, according to Randolph, have secret magic tradition and refer to a local form of witchcraft, as is also reported in many traditions of their folklore. This similarity struck me immediately, although some substantial differences should be noted. One, Ozark County is real. It was not created by an imaginative mind, and Randolph was a university lecturer, not a writer, even though his intelligence and culture were outside the norm, and he wrote his books based on his experience in the field after a decade in Ozark. Two literary productions are absolutely independent of each other. Randolph's works are posterior to 1930, as is the spread of his fame. Instead, some of the works of the myth, as well as the creation of Lovecraft Country, are prior to that year. HPL could not therefore have been inspired by the works of Randolph, even though both authors visited the two countries in the same historical period, at the beginning of the 1920s, when the backward areas of America, before the Great Depression of 1929, showed common characteristics of isolation from 20th century civilization. 3. Randolph was an ethnologist and not a novelist. The cutting of his work was academic, not dreamlike poetic like that of Lovecraft. There are disturbing similarities between Lovecraft's description of places in New England and those of the Randolph on the Ozarks. To get an idea of it, I'm reporting two tracks, one taken from The Ozark Superstition, 1947 by Randolph, and the second from The Dunwich Horror, 1928 by H.P. Lovecraft. The people who live in Ozark County of Missouri and Arkansas were, Until very recently, the most deliberately unprogressive people in the United States, descended from pioneers who came west from the southern Appalachians at the beginning of the 19th century. They made little contact with the outer world for more than 100 years. They seem like foreigners to the average urban American, but like all isolated illiterates, they have clung to the old songs and obsolete sayings and outworn customs of their ancestors. Sophisticated visitors sometimes regard the hillbilly as a simple child of nature. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The hillman is secretive and sensitive beyond anything that the average city dweller can imagine, but he isn't simple. His mind moves in a tremendously involved system of signs and omens and esoteric auguries. The other superstition. Introduction. Page 5. Randolph, a folklore scholar, here describes real places and people where he lived most of his life and objective data, which his work has made known to the public. The second word, instead, describes places and inhabitants that should be imaginary, yet they seem very similar to previous passage. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Peak, just beyond Dean's Corner, he's come upon a lonely and curious country. The trees of the frequent forest belts seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the plain fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses were a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask direction from the gnarled, solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps on the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. The natives have degenerated in a repellent way, traveling a very long stretch of that degeneration road so common in many depressed areas of New England. The average intelligence is by misfortune low, while their story overflows with wishes practiced in the sunlight, down which is century enormously old, much older than any settlement within 30 miles. A morbid community, used to their queer ways and hardened to their naive and hell-hollows origins. The Dunwich Horror. Incredibly, these descriptions are similar to Randall's workings, although Lovecraft has a completely different narrative style. Both describe a countryside, a country of America, isolated from progress, full of superstition, tradition, and of backward and rough inhabitants. But in the first case, it should be a real place, the fruit of research. In the second, it should be the fruit of imagination, but the resemblance remains. Hello!